current board member, and here to introduce our speaker tonight, Michael WilkenRobertson. And Michael has developed a lifelong collaborative relationship with Native artists and transitional authorities to foster cultural revitalization and sustainable community development. Wilken's fascination with native plants and the natural landscape of California has inspired him to explore the many ways that humans have interacted with their environment from the ancient past into the present. Wilken currently teaches in anthropology department of California State University, San Marcos. And Michael, want to come on up?
Well, good evening. How are you all doing tonight?
Woohoo! Great.
You ready for this? Yeah. So, yeah, let's turn some of the lights out. Great. So, it's just a delight to be here. I love being around, as somebody said at dinner, other plant geeks or plant nerds, because we all just love plants one way or another. And for me, it actually started as a young man growing up in the west part of San Fernando Valley, what's now West Hills, and spending my most cherished hours as a kid running around in those hills between there and Ventura and Santa Monica Mountains, and all these wonderful natural places around Los Angeles, and just starting to realize how lucky we are to have this amazing heritage of all these beautiful plantscapes. But then as a young anthropology student, and when I would go back to those places, I started to think, well, how had Native people interacted with these plant populations? And what would happen if I was dropped off here and had to figure out how to survive? How did Native people learn to do this over thousands of years? And how much could we learn just by paying attention to how the native groups of Southern California, Northern Baja California, have all the things that they had learned over thousands of years about their environments. So I moved to Baja California about 30 years ago. I had the good fortune through my grandfather to get to establish friendships with many of the tribes down there that you'll all be experts on in about 45 minutes. And that's just been a fantastic journey also to get to know many of them. And so I want to dedicate this talk and my book to Native people of Baja California and this whole region, and to everyone who in their own way is working hard to try to help preserve and educate people about this just most amazing place that we live in, the wonderful natural and cultural heritage that we have in this area. It's honestly so very little known. When it came time to publish this book, I was very pleased that the tribes in the San Diego area where the Kumeyaay live, part of the tribe, came through with funding to help publish the book, as well as some other foundations that have also helped generously. So, this is a story that starts long ago, long before our lifetimes, longer than 1,000 lifetimes. It's a story that goes back to the beginnings of time, when everything was covered by ocean. Two brother beings lived under the ocean, and after millions of years of thinking, they then began to create the earth, the land, the people, the plants and the animals, the sky, the moon, and the sun. Early on, plants and animals were people too, but slowly they evolved into the way that we know them today. For thousands of years, on the western edge of the continent, original peoples and their descendants spent their lives living along the coasts, moving in annual cycles through valleys, foothills, and up to the mountains and down to the deserts in one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. In the course of a year, they could gather seaweed along the beach in the winter, greens in the springtime as they moved up through inland valleys and foothills, pine nuts in the mountains in summer, and acorns in the fall as they headed back down to the coast, along with countless other plants along the way. The accumulated experience of thousands of generations of Native Californians interacting with their plants and landscapes, refining and building on that body of knowledge, has sustained Native populations for thousands of years in ways that stand in stark contrast to what has happened to the land and people in the last 2.5 centuries. In spite of these dramatic changes, today some of the ancient plant knowledge is carried on by the descendants of those who have lived here for so long. We would do well to listen for their wisdom. Ethnobotany is the study of the interactions between people and plants. The people I've had the great honor to work with and to know as friends are Kumeyaay, Pai, and Coat-speaking people of Baja California. Kumeyaay territory reaches from the north around Escondido in the United States to Santo Tomas in Mexico in the north. In the south of the territory, from the Pacific Ocean to the Colorado Desert. This territory, the Kumeyaay Nation, was bisected by an international border starting in 1848. Before that time, during the Spanish and Mexican periods, the area south of the present-day border, all the way down to the tip of the peninsula, was first just called California, because the Spanish started colonizing from around here, southern Baja California, around Loreto. From there, they colonized south and then north. That was just called California. And then eventually, as they moved their colonization all the way up toward the Bay Area, it became such a huge tract of land, such a huge area, that they started to call this part Baja, or Lower Antigua, Old California, and the upper part was Alta California. And then eventually in Alta California, we stopped using the Alta part, but in Baja California, we still use both Baja and California, but gringos tend to say just Baja. And so that's why sometimes people will say to me, well, where is Baja California? Is that a town south of San Diego? But it's actually the original California. So in the middle of this continuum of the Californias, the region along the Pacific coast from central California well down into northern Baja California with a Mediterranean type climate forms part of the California Floristic province, with many similarities in vegetation throughout the region. So I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the California Floristic province. We can see it here going all the way from, California Floristic province extends all the way from southern Oregon down into northern Baja California. And this part of the province that goes from around just north of Santa Barbara down into Baja California is the part that shares a lot of very similar types of plants. And so native peoples in those areas, from say the Chumash up around Santa Barbara area down to the Kiliwa Indians in Baja California, tended to use plants in a fairly similar way throughout that region. So even though some people will sometimes say, you know, well, why should I be interested in, if I live in Southern California, in native peoples and plants from Mexico? And, you know, we have to keep in mind that barrier there, that border, is a very recent phenomenon. In terms of human history of this area, going back 10 to 15,000 years, or to the beginning of time, according to Native people's way of understanding it. Just, a couple of hundred years is really a very short amount of time that border has existed. So, obviously the plants, the wildlife have nothing to do also with that particular border. So many of the plants that we'll find throughout this region, as I've mentioned, are similar. So, for example, we have in about an hour from where I live in Ensenada, who knows what this plant is? We have a nursery named after this, right? Artemisia, our coastal sagebrush that isn't a sage. Now, here it's found in its natural habitat. So what's different here? What would be in this photo if it were Southern California? Sorry? Hotels, parking lots. Okay, so we're very lucky in Baja California that we still have pristine, beautiful areas like this, where you can actually see, the natural coastal habitat, for example. And one of the interesting things too is, you see all these little white specks down here? Who knows what that is? Coastal midden. Those are shells from, it's all a huge midden, in other words, an ancient habitation site in this area. So again, we see how these areas have been affected by changes over the last few hundred years, but nothing like we have in Southern California. So we're really lucky to not only have people that still remember how these plants are used, but also to be able to see and to know these plants in their native habitat. Some of these other plants here, I'm sure you all recognize the shakarogaka. Anybody know what that one is on the lower right? Red shank. So Adenostoma sparsifolia. Anyway, these are plants that you'll find from northern Baja California all up through southern California in different natural areas. The Carrizo, you got me on that. This is the red shank you'll find up at higher, maybe above 1,000 feet. Anyway, these are all plants, of course, that were used by the native people, and we'll talk more about that. They're the places that people would go on their annual rounds, going from the coasts up into the mountains, and in Baja California down to the desert, and sometimes even over to the other coast, included desert habitat. So imagine how many different types of habitat people had access to. One of my Kumeyaay friends said, well, people always thought that we were poor, we were barefoot Indians in the past. He said, but we had a home on the coast, we had a home in the inland valleys, we had a home up in the mountains, in the desert. And how many other people can say that? So it was a very, very rich kind of a life in terms of having this amazing biodiversity that they also had a very rich knowledge of. So these are just a few more of the plants that I'm sure many of you recognize are some of our wonderful native plants from this area that grow throughout the California Floristic province. So, thanks to all these similarities between these plants, many of the ones found in Baja California Kumeyaay territory are also found in the territories of other native groups, as I've mentioned. Kumeyaay territory is located right in the heart of this continuum, partly in Baja California and partly in Alta California. Within Kumeyaay territory, there are many variations in the way people live and speak, including Ipai language in the north and Tipai language in the central and southern areas. These are language variants within the Kumeyaay region. But there are also many things about traditional culture and knowledge that are broadly shared throughout the Kumeyaay Nation, including ethnobotanical knowledge and practice. So for example, here I had brought some of the Kumeyaay from Baja California up to an acorn processing workshop in San Diego, and some of the Kumeyaay from San Diego, who only spoke English in Kumeyaay, were able to have conversations with Baja California Kumeyaay because they all spoke Kumeyaay. They didn't need English or Spanish because their native language they had in common, and fortunately some of them still were fluent in those languages. This common culture that transcends the recently imposed international order forms what I'm calling a shared heritage of the Californians. Today, south of the border, many Kumeyaay live in remote ranches where native plants may still be abundant and continue to form an essential part of local economies. Many of the elders I've worked with over the years grew up speaking only their native language, walking barefoot, getting their water from a creek, and living in homes made from local plants. Some of their grandparents remembered stories of missionaries, soldiers, and marauding Colorado River Indian tribes. They've been extremely poor and faced countless hardships, but at the same time, their native culture and knowledge of the land often helped them survive. Many of the plant specialists I've worked with never had a formal education, but their vast knowledge of plants and every part of the environment never ceases to amaze me. Although many have now passed on, fortunately new generations of elders and recently more and more younger people have become interested in learning and transmitting plant knowledge. One of the great joys of my life has been the enduring friendships with many of the elders that I've had the opportunity to work with over the last 39 years. People like Teodora Cuero of La Huerta, who passed away in her mid-90s only a few years ago. Teodora was a dear friend, teacher, and kindred spirit whose joyful and dignified manner, and profound affection for the land of her ancestors has been an inspiration for many. John Mesa, a traditional singer, and as he described himself, a binational Indian, spent many of his final years mentoring and passing on his knowledge of songs, plants, and other aspects of traditional culture to his students. Celia Silva of San Jose de la Zorra, whose wonderful sense of humor and vast knowledge of plants made visits with her an absolute delight. Fortunately, some elders like Teresa Castro continue to share their skills and wisdom in their own communities and at reservations, parks, universities, and other sites in the U.S. and Mexico. A younger generation of up-and-coming elders also continues to keep ethnobotanical knowledge and practice alive through teaching and the ongoing use of native plant foods and medicines, tools, construction materials, and ceremony. Many of this generation are also fluent speakers of their native languages and participate in speaking and research and teaching. Kumeyaay, Paipai, and Coat languages spoken in this area are closely related to other native languages of Baja California and Arizona, belonging to a larger family of languages known as the Yuman languages. These are very ancient languages of the Pacific coast. They belong to an even larger phylum, we call it, in linguistics, of languages that were probably descended from the earliest peoples that came in along the Pacific coast and decided they liked it here and that they were going to stay. Eventually, other groups came in from other parts of the Americas, so California ends up having just an amazing diversity of cultures and languages. But these are probably some of the most ancient ones. These were once the dominant languages spoken in this region. These languages are now spoken fluently by only a small number of native speakers, many of them living in Baja California. The Yuman languages, in their broad extension from the Pacific coast to the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River, remind us of the thousands of years of history in this region. Relationships between these languages, such as Kumeyaay and Pukapa, Pai Pai, and the upland Pai languages, reflect ancient cultural constructions. And I came back to this slide because I just wanted to mention that working right now on a National Science Foundation project to compare some of the words for plants in languages like Pai Pai from Baja California and the related language, Pai languages, Wallapai, Havasupai, and Yavapai from Arizona. It's kind of curious that somehow this group of languages ended up down here in Baja California, while the more closely related languages to it are separated by other languages. So just as English appears in England and South Africa and the United States and Australia and New Zealand, we know that there's a lot of history behind those migrations. And obviously people have been migrating for thousands of years, as we can see here. So working with linguists and with members of the tribes themselves, we're trying to reconstruct the ancient history of the language through plant names. Isn't that interesting? So during my field work, I had the opportunity to collaborate with many of these native speakers to document plants and their uses in both Kumeyaay language and in Spanish. In many cases, the names of the plants are similar or the same throughout the region and can help us reconstruct these ancient relationships between native groups. So I do want to mention here, of course we all know and love salvia, the salvia apiana, yes, thanks, white sage. And in the book, I give the English and Spanish names, obviously the scientific names, and then all the different versions of the Kumeyaay names that I could find, whether those were in previous literature about the Kumeyaay or things that I gathered myself. And what you see here appears to be a huge diversity in the names for these plants. But actually, a lot of it is diversity in the way people wrote down sounds that we just don't have in English or in Spanish. So the word for white sage in Kumeyaay is dai. Dai. Can you say that? Dai. Sounds like a dead rattlesnake. Well, it's dai. It has a phoneme or a sound that is kind of a combination of an S-L-T-H with a little Y in there. And it's actually a very common name throughout in American languages, which in linguistic terms means languages of the Americas. And so a place like Seattle was probably originally Siat, or avocado was probably original aguacat. Peanut was probably cacahuat. There's a lot of words that are TL in the way that they've been anglicized, but that was a very common sound. So this gives you a little idea of some of the diversity in the way things have been written, but even within the languages themselves, within the variants of Kumeyaay language, there might be different ways that people would say the word thai. So just like we might have a word like acorn, you know, if you were from England, how would you say that? Acorn, right? Acorn. If you were from the South? Acorn. So those are all the same words, and we recognize them as the same word, but linguists would write them phonetically in a completely different way, right? But we can still hear it and kind of know what they're talking about. So the same thing can happen with words in native languages, and by having been there for living in a place for centuries, if not millennia, those words, those different differences evolve and are part of what make people's identity. Just as today, if you hear someone with an English accent or a Southern accent, you might assume certain things about their identity, which might be fair or not, but we do that. So, the archaeological record of the region tells the story of how ancient peoples create stone tools like matatis to process seeds like bitter acorns and cherry stones and transform them into nutritious foods. Some Kumeyaay continue to carry on these traditions today. Fragments of cordage, nets, and sandals found in archaeological sites have been dated at over 9,000 years old and are reminders of the ancient origins of traditions still carried on today by a few native artisans like Teresa Castro, a Coat and Pai Pai speaker of Santa Catarina. So that 9,000 year date, I learned about that through Matt Delorier, who is a teacher here at CSUN. He's an archaeologist, and he's been doing ongoing excavations at Sabres Island, about halfway down the peninsula. And in a very ancient village site, they found cordage just like this, very similar, that they were able to date that far back. So, and these few women are still carrying on this tradition. Prehistoric basketry, occasionally found in archaeological sites, also reminds us that native people from throughout the Southern California and Baja California region have long been producing baskets made from local plant materials for processing and storage of plant foods. Split juncus coil basketry, strong, beautiful, and durable, is also part of this shared cultural heritage of the Californias. So this type of basketry was often called mission basketry in Southern California. It was made by Tongva people from this area, Chumash people. Sometimes they would use deer grass, or they might add Rus trilobata, different materials that we don't have in Baja California, but the basic structure and technology was very similar in this type of a coiled basket. Today's basket makers create an astounding variety of beautifully crafted designs and shapes, using the same basic techniques passed on from their grandmothers. In Baja California, these baskets are made primarily in the Kumeyaay community of San Jose de la Zorra, using two types of native juncus found in creeks and wetlands of the region. Traditional Kumeyaay techniques, before I go on with this, I want to point out that in this slide you can see that this is one of the types of juncus that they use. This is the Juncus acutus, which probably many of you know, grows in many of our wetlands. And this, that's used for the weaver, the part that goes around and around and around, is Juncus textilis. So we'll talk a little about each one of those. Let's see. Traditional Kumeyaay techniques for management of the juncus harvest may provide useful guidelines for sustainable harvesting of this important basketry material. So what we see here then is the Juncus acutus growing in a typical situation by one of our creeks. And it's, as you can see, it's a clumping kind of a juncus, looks kind of grassy. Have any of you ever had a close encounter with this? It's pokey, right? So you don't want to get too close. But if there's a big flood or something, it tends to get coppiced. It gets cuts down to almost to the roots. And then it grows back beautifully. And so often when they're cutting this off, they'll sort of imitate that way of harvesting. Now, this is the Juncus textilis. This is the one that's used for the weaver. It has to be really strong because it's pulled really tight. And then, as you can also see, the base of the leaves has this dark brown color. And how do you think that is used? For the patterns, for the designs. Now, the way that the women pull those out, first of all, they prefer to do this around the time of the full moon because they have, many people around the world, they have the belief that
certain way of pulling up certain ones. They don't pull everything up. And they come back to these same places year after year because they believe that the way they're harvesting helps the plant and will help provide a sustained harvest for them. Now, another type of basketry they make is made out of our willow, salix. And I can't tell you it's red willow or black willow. I can't tell you exactly which type because they have the different types there, and it's kind of used both of them interchangeably. But this is also made in a coil way, and it's kind of ingenious the way they use the leaves and the stems to create a granary where they can store acorns that, unlike, say, a plastic bag that doesn't let any air in, this allows the air to come in and keeps the acorns nice and dry. So it's an ideal way to store acorns. And I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but as they say now, I saw it on the internet. I've heard that there's some kind of a substance in the leaves that helps keep critters away. Even so, the women, when they have a large granary, they go through it periodically to take any of the acorns out that might have a little hole in them. The development of pottery over the last 1,000 years also provided Native Californians with more options for processing and storing plant materials. The dried stalks of the Mojave yucca proved to be an ideal medium for firing pottery. Cooking, toasting, soaking, storage, and other uses of pottery have allowed the Kumeyaay to use their plant resources more intensively and in an ever wider number of ways. So as these kinds of technology, the pottery, basketry, came into the region, became more prevalent, we also see archaeologically more intensive use of plant resources. And one of the things that some researchers have been trying to understand better is how this human-plant interaction actually affected the plant landscapes that we consider wild wilderness or wild landscapes, which many Native people say, no, these have been tended by Native people for thousands of years. That's what, we've been picking and choosing, selecting the ones that we want and taking care of them in ways that have affected the populations. So that's something that researchers are looking into. It's an area of very healthy debate, and I find it a fascinating part of this whole area of ethnobotany. The arrival of the Spanish in the region beginning in 1540 and starting permanent colonization in about 1769 drastically affected the Kumeyaay and their relationships with their environments. The introduction of foreign diseases, livestock ranching, and agriculture would forever change the Kumeyaay way of life. No longer able to freely move throughout their traditional territories, many of them eventually took up a more sedentary way of life, planting crops, corn, beans, squash, things like that. The Kumeyaay found ways to transform their world while maintaining traditional knowledge that helped them survive. So, for example, they went from making round houses out of willow to making larger square houses because now they were living more in a more sedentary way, often as workers on the ranches of the colonists. Fortunately, the shared heritage of plant knowledge has continued to provide food, medicine, tools, construction materials, and ceremonial items for Native people in this region. So we can just see some examples here of just a few ways that people are still using these things today. In the upper left, some elderberry blossoms that somebody had hanging in their yard. On the right, anybody want to guess what they're making tea out of? Ephedra. Good. Excellent. Sometimes known as Mormon tea, we call it Indian tea.
Today, their lands in Baja California have been reduced to a fraction of their original territories. They're located in 4 federally recognized communities. Although these communities usually have a central village, like this one, which is bustling downtown Santa Catarina, many people also live in remote ranches or outposts. So this, for example, is an outpost where a few cowboys live during the summer. They raise their cattle up there. So we can see that they've made ramada, or a shade roof, which is a very traditional form of vernacular architecture for these groups. Archaeologists find the remains of these in sites, and that's made with arrowweed and often with whatever is there locally, probably cottonwood. But also we see that there are things that they have picked and chosen from different periods of their history, such as the adobe that they made a little stove from here that they use probably to heat up tortillas or do carne asada. That's from the mission period. A refrigerator, you think it's plugged in? There's nowhere to plug it. So what's it used for? Storage. They're great for keeping critters away. You know, the old pickup truck that somebody gave to an auction years ago, and now they keep it going for another 50 years in Baja California. It's quite amazing. A little trailitas, they call it, a little place to sleep to keep you away from the rattlesnakes. So that's a kind of a typical cowboy outpost. This is another one of the communities, La Huerta, where Teodora, the elder that I showed you a lot of pictures of, she lived back up in where the creek comes out to this area. Off to the side of the Guadalupe Valley, which is Mexico's wine country. There's San Antonio Necua, another Kumeyaay community, and they have this beautiful mountain up above it with a relic forest of pine muricata pines, Venus muricata. And then in other parts of their territory, like Meji, this is called Ha'a, which means Cottonwood Canyon. You can probably guess why. So these are just some of the typical landscapes that you would find in northern Baja California, some of the rural areas. I love this photo because it was taken by a young Kumeyaay man. He was about 16 at the time. The basket makers lived down under the old woodland here. And he posted this to Facebook. And I sent him a message. I said, Angel, I love that picture, and I need a picture of your community for my book. Can I use this? He said, sure, yeah, go ahead. And I said, what were you doing up on that hill? He said, oh, I go up there every day to pick up my messages and check my Facebook. He rides his horse up there. And he said, oh, I thought I'd take a picture of my community from up there. So this is our modern day, this is how we anthropologists do our work nowadays. We call it collaborative art anthropology, and we work together with tribal members. And it's wonderful to see younger members of the communities also involved. He does a lot of documentation of his own community. So the book goes through 47 different native plants and gives basic information about each plant and some of the stories that I recorded with the elders that I got to work with. It provides their scientific names, English, Spanish names, Kumeyaay variants. And for example, with the Dickelostoma, the blue dicks, there's a really interesting story about these that I actually learned from Kat Anderson's book. If you're interested in knowing more about California, Alta California Traditional Management by Native Peoples of California. She wrote about, in one of the many things she writes about in Before the Wilderness, that's the name of her book, is how native gatherers would gather the corms at the base of these plants. The gatherers would talk about how they would just take the mother bulb and leave all the little baby bulbs. And you can see they're kind of attached by a little filament. And once the
the collectors go in and gather this, they've kind of aerated it, they made a little hole for the water to go down into when the rain comes, the soil's a little softer there, they cover it back over, and where there was one plant, when they come back next year, there's a whole bunch of plants. So imagine that effect on the population of these. When Native people were busy gathering throughout this whole area and had traditional gathering techniques that impacted the populations of these native plants, we're just beginning to understand how immense that impact was. And when I started asking those questions to people in Baja California, they told me, oh yeah, we do the same thing. You know, we just take the larger one, we leave the little one so that they'll come back. Another one of my favorite plants is the lizard's tail, the yerba mansa. And this is a wonderful medicinal. It's a natural antiseptic. It's a great one if you have a little moist area with rich soil in your own gardens. Highly recommend this one. It's got just a wonderful scent to it. Every part of it is medicinal. And these are the rhizomes that spread. So if you put it somewhere, it's going to kind of spread into that area. We don't recommend, of course, gathering these from the wild. There are many wonderful native plant nurseries that we all can support. And we want to support the ones that are getting their materials in an ethical way. So it's great to go and get materials from places like that and add them to your native landscape. Another plant that's used a lot down there is the thistle sage. They consider it a kind of chia. Of course, all of the chias and sages are from the mint family, and all of these were used as food. The very tiny hard seeds from the sage plant are quite delicious. So if you're out and you want to just taste one, you just kind of tap on the dried up seed stalk, and you can taste them. They have a wonderful flavor. Well, it turns out it was a very important food for Native people. And of course, the plant itself is, the sage plants are medicinal in many ways. The chia could be gathered and just slightly toasted, made into a drink. It has a kind of a smoky flavor. It's really nice. It has to be a little ground in a grinding stone, and they like to add some honey to it. So, or just plain. It doesn't have to be sweetened. It's delicious and very nutritious, of course. Now we know that it's a superfood. Same thing that Native Californians have known for thousands of years. One of my favorite plants that wasn't on my radar before I did this work is bladderpod. And this grows all the way from the ocean to the desert. It's a great one for your gardens. It blooms almost all year long. I highly recommend it. It smells weird, but the blooms can be picked off and made into kind of they can be boiled and water thrown off a couple of times to get the strong flavor out, and then it's like a vegetable. So they call it shash, and it's one of their favorite foods. In fact, this is out gathering it, and then once it's cooked and the water thrown off a couple of times, you can make it into a taco if you want. I've had these, they're really quite delicious and very satisfying. They keep you full for a long time. Now, another plant that I think we've overlooked in terms of its importance food-wise is the Prunus ilicifolia. And of course, this is from the Prunus family that includes things like almonds, cherries, plums. And the part of it that was most important for Native people wasn't necessarily the fruits, although you can eat the sort of thin skin on the outside that's quite delicious, but it's really the dried kernel that is the most valuable because it can be cleaned and ground up and kind of cleaned and then bleached to make a delicious kind of a mush. But you have to know what you're doing, and I do always have to give a disclaimer here and say, kids, don't try this at home. Because, as my Native friends have said, you really need to know what you're doing when you're going to try this out, because For example, with all of these plants in the Prunus family, most of them have cyanide in them. And so you have to leach out the cyanide before you can eat it. And when you finally do come up with a final kind of a mush, it has a wonderful almondy flavor. But as I say, make sure you know what you're doing, or somebody who's done it before that knows how to do it is doing that whole process. Manzanita, just one of our most beautiful native plants, and also great for native gardens. Slow grower, I know, but quite a wonderful plant in many, many different varieties. This is the variety that they like to use in Baja California to gather and make a drink out of. They have to first moisten the seeds, then grind them in a grinding stone, not too hard because you want to get the seeds out and remove those, and then the sort of appley, it's like a dried apple, probably why it's called manzanita. You grind that a little more and make a drink out of it, and it's quite delicious. Another plant that I really recommend for your gardens, it's not native to California, just barely not native here because it's endemic to Baja California, almost makes it to the border, but they do really well here, need very little water, and they're just spectacular in a garden. Grow slowly, but with a little water, they'll grow a little faster. The Brahea armata, or Mexican blue palm. And native people ate the seeds, the fruits. There's a little covering around the seed that's sweet and also makes a nice drink. Many of these foods were served either as kind of a porridge or as an agua fresca, we say in Spanish, a drink. Just like the seeds from our glorious regal California fan palm. The fan palms could produce in a year, in a year's harvest, just tons of food for desert peoples. So they were also a very important food for the Kumeyaay, for the Serrano, for the Kumeyaay going further south, and others. Of course, many uses for these plants. The fronds could also be used for making houses. Even the stem of the frond, I'm sure I'm using the wrong term, sorry about this, is great for making a spoon that you can stir your acorn mush with. So imagine all the ways that plants can be used. This also is an example of how people use plants for making a bow and arrow. The bow here is made out of willow. That's pretty standard throughout Southern California. Pretty simple but very effective wooden bow made out of willow usually. The arrows here are made out of mule fat. They could be made out of arrowweed, Luchea sericea. Anybody want to guess what this is? The quiver? What is it? Quiver made out of yucca. The chaparral yucca stalks. And then also the tips, the hardwood tips here, they didn't always use stone tips. The hardwood tips are chamise or Adenostoma fasciculatum, the chamise that's so common in our chaparral habitat around here. So just about everything in the past, they would have made this, the bowstring, and this cordage, or this would have been made out of cordage. In Baja California, out of yucca or agave fiber. Up here, anybody know what they were using for cordage? Our Asclepias, milkweeds, made beautiful cordage. Now, we also have an endemic down there, which is Quercus peninsularis. It's a sweet acorn. You can eat it right out of the shell. Doesn't have to be bleached. And I'm going to finish up here. Just want to mention that as part of the project that I did for my, this book came out of a master's thesis, and as my internship, I helped create this museum at the Tecate Community Museum. It's all about Native people of Baja California, as you might guess, and we have gardens around it that have native plants. Of course, this is a pepper tree, but
All of the other plants around there are native plants and with signage, so I encourage you to go and visit that sometime, Takati Community Museum. And some of the proceeds from this book go to programs with members of the tribes who are doing workshops with other members of the tribes, especially the younger people, to teach ethnobotanical knowledge, to pass it on. And then another part of the proceeds from this go toward the scholarship program for Kumeyaay and other native scholars in Baja California. So I will have we do have the book for sale. I can sign it for you and dedicate it to you if you'd like. I also have a sign-up list if you're interested in going on little trips, tours, excursions down to Baja California and either visiting the communities or the plant specialists or going out to the wine country. So thank you very much for your attention, and that's it. Do I have any time for questions and answers? Okay, good. Yes.
I've always been interested in hearing about things like having to leach the cyanide out of prunus leaves. How did people figure that out? How did they survive figuring it out?
I'll repeat the question for you. This is the most asked question. How do people figure these things out? Like she says, I've been interested in the idea that you have to leach the cyanide out of the prunus kernels. How did they figure it out? Do any of you want to? Yes.
So my best guess is that they found some in a river somewhere and it was edible. That it was already naturally leached and they figured that out just by looking at it.
So her answer is that maybe they found some in a river that had been naturally leached and it was edible, and that way they figured it out. So any other thoughts? I don't really have the answer. Yes.
I had a visitor from Lebanon looking at the olive trees at my place, a Christian, and he said, this proves there is a God, that somehow people figured out how to make a food out of an olive using poison.
Okay, so super divine intervention. That's another possibility, which is not as far off as some of you might think. My thought about it is we have to really try to understand, get it through our heads, what it means when people live in a place for thousands of years. And generation after generation of people are interacting with these plants and passing that knowledge on. Have any of you have ancestors that have been here more than, say, 200 years? 200?
I have ancestors that have been on the continent since time began.
Okay, so ancestors that have been on the continent since time began. So that would mean that you would be able to relate to this idea that people pass that knowledge on, over hundreds of generations of people living and using these plants and learning about them, trial and error, telling other people about it. I'm assuming, I don't want to put words into your mouth. Whereas it's hard for those of us who came, my grandparents on some sides go back to gold rush time, it's 1848, but even they never knew that much about the plants here because they got their food from agricultural plants, from introduced plants in other places. But my point is that we need to try to get it through our heads what it means when people have lived in a place for so long, and how that relationship with the plants is so profoundly different from that of those of us who came later. Now, it is amazing, like when people depend on those plants. Mark Plotkin, who wrote the Shaman's Apprentice, he talks about people who came from Africa and settled in Suriname, I think it was, only about
300 years ago. And they know those plants now really well because they depend on them. And they learn from the native people in that area. And so, you know, that in that case, they were able to learn what people had learned over time. Now, what people like Plotkin also learned from talking to shamans in those areas and plant specialists is that they also have their understanding of plant knowledge that can be, in their culture, something that's learned through dreams, learned through this profound kind of knowledge where, like the Kumeyaay, plants are considered that they were like people at the beginning of time, and that there are plant spirits, and that those plant spirits talk to people. And so the plant spirits may tell people, a shaman in a dream, hey, you should go over and gather some of that other guy over there and put us together for this patient that you have. And lo and behold, that other plant activates some kind of substance in this, you know, in this plant that makes it work way better. So I'm mentioning that because that's not just an isolated thing, that's something that ethnobotanists have found in many parts of the world, that there is kind of this spiritual aspect too that people have when they've interacted with plants for thousands of years. One of the consultants that spoke to an anthropologist that worked in the Kumeyaay area in the 1920s told him that he lived out in a house by himself in the middle of an area, a grove of hollyleaf cherry. And he said, well, my hollyleaf cherries told me that somebody died in this other village. And then it turned out to be true. And he said, and why shouldn't they tell me? They're my cherries. You know, he's lived with those cherries all his life. They're his plant. I have that kind of relationship with some cypresses that I planted that have been in my life, all my life, and they're like my trees, you know. So I think that's part of the answer, is this kind of a profound relationship that may be hard for us to understand. Although, because you're all plant people, you probably can. Yes?
Well, I would think so much of it would have been trial and error over a long period of time. And I mean, the unfortunate thing is some people may have been sick if things were not leached properly or may have died. And it's also true of plants that would cure, that they would use certain plants and they would help people.
Yeah.
But I'm sure on some of the ones that they ate, you know, some people would have undoubtedly sickened or died from them not being prepared properly.
Yeah, so trial and error definitely was part of it. And I think in the project I'm working on related to the names of plants in Pai languages, many of the Walpai elders are not really wanting to share a lot of knowledge of plants because they're afraid that people will misuse them and that people will get sick and die because many of these plants have certain ways that they need to be harvested, they need to be processed, they need to be dosed, certain times of year that they can be eaten or not eaten. So there's that part of it too, that the alkaloids, which are often what makes them medicinal, are very powerful substances. I hear people sometimes saying, oh, I only like plant medicines because they have no side effects. And I sometimes say, well, one side effect is death. If you don't know what you're doing, you know. I mean, they're very powerful substances, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, they were hunters and gatherers that didn't really have clothes. The women would make bark skirts. I showed you one of a agave or a yucca fiber skirt that one woman had made. But the European explorers talked about them being naked, and the women decently covered with aprons, they said. But they didn't really have clothes to dye. So the dyes that they had would have been for things like their basketry materials, and they used oak bark and soot and other natural materials for making that kind of a dye. And then I've seen roots that give a yellow and a bright and a red kind of a dye for like suede that could be made, say, from a deer skin. So they did have some deer skin that they might make coverings for, that I'm guessing they might have used that for dyeing. But the main dyes were pigments were used for face painting and body painting. That would have been red, white, black, those kinds of colors. And those mostly came from minerals. But, and they were used for cave paintings too. But apparently the wild cucumber seeds, you know that wild cucumber that it looks like an alien creature that we see all over the place? Those seeds could be kind of roasted and toasted and an oil squeezed out of them. And that was added to minerals to make paint, body paint, or rock art type of paint. And in further south in Baja California, where we have great, amazing mural art, some of it has actually been dated because it has the juice from some of the columnar cacti that grow down there, the sap, that is used as a binder. So, so plants are still involved in those kinds of ways. Are we out of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.